Hello, Sunday. The first two things I'm going to link to are for your reading entertainment if you want to follow the links and read them. The first one is from Citigroup, Willem Bouter, their chief economist, and it's about 110, 20-page long PDF, but so far I'm quite a long way into it, and it reads like a book. It's useful, it's entertaining, and it's obviously been written by Willem himself because you can see it in every word. This is the start of chapter 3, or part 3. What caused the great leveraging? Debt, risky debt and equity. Why does debt exist in the first place? And this is kind of an exhibition of how well he writes and how useful it is as a read overall. Before discussing the drivers of the great deleveraging, and the whole paper, the note is about leveraging up and leveraging down, it's worth reminding ourselves why debt exists in the first place and why taking on more debt seemed to be a good idea to so many and for so long. So first thing we've got to bear in mind that when we're talking about debt, you've got a lender and a borrower. Okay. Debt is an inflexible liability. That's to the borrower. Debt is an inflexible liability to the borrower. In its purest risk-free form, the future payments due cannot respond to unforeseeable or unforeseen changes in the ability of the debtor to pay. And that's more from the eye through the eyes of the lender, that it doesn't matter what happens in the world. The world can turn to shit and all sorts of horrible things can happen, but the debt contract is there, invariable, and you should get invariably paid on your debt, the money that you've lent. And the debtor, indeed, in the case of risk-free debt, debt is not a contingent contract, but a fixed contract. The inflexibility of the payment stream associated with debt is, of course, what makes it attractive as an asset class to many savers and investors, in particular because contractual inflexibility was sometimes confused with lack of risk. See, there's a lot in there, but hopefully you picked up on it. They thought it was lack of risk just because it was an invariable contract and they were guaranteed the money. Somebody had signed it, so they had to be paid. But they thought, well, if they've got to be paid, then it's not risky. But of course, there is the risk that they can't pay, and that's where we are now. But that's an exhibition of the sort of stuff that Willem Bouter is writing in that City note as their chief economist. And it's worth reading, but, it's a 110-page PDF, so I can understand if you don't. The next one is Business Insider. I've got permission from Mark Farber to put his latest presentation that he's just done out in Singapore, I think it was, up, and you've just got all his charts that he was obviously talking about. And Mark Farber's always an interesting person to listen to. I've got this one up as just one of his things he was talking about. He's getting towards the end. It's mostly about investing, which we generally don't talk about. But these are investment holdings of the different things that make up the things that people have invested in. Gold's at the top, but you can see it's just it's actually the bright red, and it's just a little layer of paint at the top of all this. Equity securities, the purple at the underneath the gold, but effectively at the top. Private debt securities, corporate debt, that sort of thing, or mortgages, I suppose. Government debt, self-explanatory, and bank deposits. That's just where the bank deposits. Okay, and going back to 1980, but we've got to watch this chart for its trickiness. But it's not tricky to be deceptive, it's just tricky, you've got to watch it. Starts in 1980 with all of those things adding up to about $15 trillion. Then there's a 10-year gap to 1990 where it goes up to $50 trillion. So it's gone from 15 to $50 trillion in 10 years. Then there's a 5-year gap to 1995. Then it's 2000. So if we take the 10 years, it's gone from 15 in 1980 to 50 in 1990 to 110 in the year 2000. and then we go yearly 0, 1, 0, 2, etc. And the figures are only up to 0.9, but basically it's up to 200 trillion, probably by 2010. So from 110 trillion up to 200 trillion, coming from 50 trillion and starting there at 15 trillion. So you can, it's one hell of a rise that's gone up there. Anyway, so a lot more money batting around the world, numbers. Okay, so the rest of those are there if you want to follow the link and look at the rest of Mark Farber's presentation photos. Right, let's finish with Gillian Tett again, because she's writ another article. FT Magazine, Onwards and Upwards is the main heading, with the strap underneath as, in a world without innovation and without expansion, it will be much harder to keep democracy going. And she starts writing, what do you need to make democracy work in the modern world? That's something that many Americans might be asking as things go on. She just happens to be working out of America at the moment, so obviously a lot of her stuff is America-centered. From this article, she writes, but these days Thiel, that's Peter Thiel, the entrepreneur, he was PayPal and invested early in Facebook, is worried in particular, and as he wrote in a recent column for the Financial Times, co-authored with Gary Kasparov, which wasn't a very dynamic article, I didn't think, the former chess champion, he fears that the pace of innovation in America and the world, but particularly in America, is slowing down. To be sure, he asserts, the country produced plenty of innovative ideas after the Second World War, but in the past 30 years, this creativity has withered, sapped by the financial boom and the rise of newly risk-averse culture. People want safe debt and invariable income streams. You cannot compare the iPhone 5 with Apollo 5, he laments. Innovation has declined. All debatable, you can debate it if you like. Later in the article she writes, but if you think that Thiel is even half correct, it begs another question. What does this mean for the political culture? ? For what makes Thiel really concerned about America today is his belief that a world without innovation, or with not enough innovation, will also be a place with dramatically slower growth. And without expansion, it will be much harder to keep democracy working, even in America. Quote, democracy works where voters think that things are getting better. He argues it is an open question whether you can have a democracy in a world with zero-sum growth. Okay. So from the comment section, I've picked a long comment by somebody called Alpha Male, who brings a couple of good comment points forward. This is an interesting article. However, something like 70% of the US economy, measured as GDP, cannot grow as it is geared to the consumer. That is right. 70% of GDP is consumer spending. And the consumer is deleveraging and being squeezed by QE. So the idea that innovation can offset this fundamental contraction is laughable. However, your other question, can we have democracy without growth, is an interesting one. It seems clear to me, the alpha male. The answer is yes, because, after all, many of our democracies are already quite old and have lived through times far more challenging than the present. And he goes on. It's, as I say, it's quite a long comment, and I'm towards the end of the comment I've grabbed another large section that I'll read. Perhaps that argument is redundant. But there also seems to be a lot of confusion as to what the nature of growth actually is. Call me a cynic, but I think growth has largely been achieved by printing ever more dollars, and human benefits have been derived from the consequences of humans striving to collect as many of those dollars as possible via business structures. However, there is no guarantee that there is a one-to-one relationship between this human activity and the human benefit, as in this grabbing of dollars isn't necessarily good for actually the people. And in fact, we can now see that there has been an enormous wealth transfer to those who became very good at collecting lots of dollars at the expense, essentially, of those who are not, as in school teachers, small businesses, university professors, and other workers who get paid market rate for their services. Unless society finds a way to reverse this flow, there cannot be any economic growth. I've always felt that a healthy democracy requires a large middle class, instinctively large educated groups of people with skin in the game, who have sufficient means to both defend their interests and think of the greater public good. In other words, they're comfortable enough in themselves, they feel a part of it so much that they keep things spinning because they feel a part of it, and their whole life is just geared to keeping everything spinning because it's just a nice way to live. However, this configuration is clearly under threat. If our governments and elites cannot willingly find a solution to this problem, give back significant amounts of wealth, then a revolution will be the only alternative. This is a tangible risk, however undesirable, and time will tell. I'd argue that innovation doesn't have too much to do with this question, however, unless you view it as an efficient, large-scale mechanism by which wealth is redistributed from the elite to the rest of society. Perhaps that is what we are talking about, but it can never be on the scale required to address the current problems in our society, as it cannot come close to that 70% of GDP figure required to generate growth in consumer spending. Indeed, to offset decline, we've not had the US austerity yet, fiscal cliff, etc., which, if it doesn't come now, as in organised by the politicians at the end of this year, must come in the future. Whether the politicians or the markets, heaven forbid, decide. The real deleveraging that might have to come, which will knock down that 70% of GDP. Anyway, a good comment there from Alpha Male. Lots to discuss. Leave it with you. It's tricky, isn't it? Very, very tricky. Bye.